My name is Aoife Buckley. I'm a rehabilitation worker and a comms. I've worked as a rehab worker for almost 2 decades now with social services, sensory impairment teams in the UK, with the Irish Guide Dogs for the Blind, and for the last 8 years with the NCBI, the National Council for the Blind in Ireland. Just 6 months ago, I joined Rob and the others in the Possibility Lab team in the NCBI. So I have moved from supporting the individual service user to find their way around the environment to making changes to that environment, which will enable many service users to move around with ease and confidence.
Dzień dobry, mam na imię Rob Tobin, jestem architektem I pracuję w NCBI w Dublin. Good afternoon, my name is Rob Tobin. I'm an architect and I practice with NCBI, the National Council for the Blind of Ireland in Dublin. I joined NCBI in 2022, where I work as an access consultant and collaborating with my comms colleagues. I support our service users, and our work includes advising some of my peers in industry to make buildings and public places more accessible for people with disabilities and to make them universally accessible.
So what is the Possibility Lab? Well, it's a growing team. It currently consists of 3 comms and 1 architect. 2 of the team are access consultants also. We're based in the NCBI. As I said, the head office is in Dublin, but we work to cover the whole country of Ireland. The NCBI is the statutory service provider for services for people with vision impairment in Ireland. We're an innovative and pioneering team, and our mission is to raise awareness, to train, to provide consultation, and to advise on promoting an accessible society. We come from diverse backgrounds. And Rob, what brought you to the Possibility Lab?
Well, as an architect, I've always been interested in the experience of space through all the senses. So that's something that drew me to an agency that works for people with sight loss, and how buildings and places are experienced through the other senses. Architecture might be considered primarily a visual medium, a visual culture, but there's so much more to buildings, and they're so much richer when we think about other ways they're perceived and understood. I might just speak briefly about the photograph, the building that's on screen. So these first 2 images, these first 2 slides show L'Institut du Monde Arabe. It's a public building in Paris by the famous French architect Jean Nouvel. So the photograph shows a detail of the facade of that building, and it's a facade that responds to changes in daylighting conditions as the sky over Paris changes, as daylight conditions change. This very intricate facade, it's based on forms in Arabic geometry, which ties in with the theme of the building. It twitches just as the eye adjusts to differing lighting conditions. It's quite a beautiful design, and for me that was it gave me an early understanding. A field trip there, I developed an understanding, a sense of buildings that are designed to respond to their context, to different ways of experiencing space. And that shapes the human perception both inside and outside the building. As we look then at the next image, this is looking from the inside out of that same building. So as the facade changes, we've got 2 images on screen at the moment. One when there's quite a bright sky, and one when there's a slightly duller sky. The same view is shaped, and that shapes the perception of the exterior. So as architects, architects are taught to consider buildings and places primarily through visual culture. That includes photography, sketches, computer-generated images, and drawings. I remember a university critic who was a well-known architect describing architecture as the craft of light and space. So how we define space with walls, with ceilings, with floors, that determines how light behaves in the space. But I always considered architecture as something more than what we do to define light and visual boundaries, and that like we're hearing activity around us outside today. So the boundaries of perception extend beyond this room. And it's not just about defining a volume, defining how light behaves. It's more about there's a more rounded perception than what's immediately here. Okay, sorry, I'm between devices here. So that kind of outlines what drew me to Possibility Lab and my background. Yeah. And if we consider the Oslo Opera House, which is shown on screen now, so this is, for urban planners and architects, this would be considered the jewel in the crown of Oslo's waterfront. It's a masterpiece. It's a place that people, residents in Oslo, visitors to the city, they flock to this beautiful white building that's right on the harbour front, and there's great views when you get up there. But I wondered if maybe, you know, the architect has made a bold statement here. What do you see as an O&M, as a comms, when you look at this space?
Okay, so there is a lot of evidence to tell us that how vision impairment and blindness impacts on a person's ability to live independently and to participate in society. Without a doubt, a barrier to independent mobility is the design of features in that society. Brian Reed is a designer, and he said, everything is designed, few things are designed well. This resonated with me as an O&M instructor, because so many times I've walked into a visually beautiful building, and when I've looked for other qualities within that building, I found that the building was completely inaccessible to many people in our society. Blind people face numerous challenges in navigating buildings and public spaces, and a well-designed building can greatly enhance their mobility and independence. So in answer to your question, Rob, about Oslo Opera House, I think it illustrates my point. It is visually stunning, indeed. It's very interesting, but it has a lengthy step along where the shadow is, and there is no indication of that step. I would see the surfaces as glare producing, with light bouncing off the light colored surfaces, and there are no features that have been designed for wayfinding. Now, you're aware of the design features that are needed at the onset of the project, but how did you come to this awakening?
Thanks. So I've touched on how students are taught to think of architecture primarily as a visual medium. There's a visual culture in architecture. Part of my early studies, I researched surveillance culture, architecture, and paranoia. So how perhaps the ruler in a given city or region built a very imposing structure up on a hill to survey their city, their kingdom, to impose control on the people who lived there. So the example on screen at the moment is the Citadel in Aleppo in Syria, which is a building I studied. There are other examples. I'll just go to the next slide. There's the full-blown paranoia of socialist Albania, and almost 1 million concrete bunkers were built there to, again, impose social order on people. This manifestation of the ruler's paranoia that he was going to be invaded has resulted in this really strange topography of almost 1 million concrete bunkers spread around that small country. So this is an architecture of surveillance. It's an architecture of what is seen, both looking out and their presence in the landscape. These are very visible. So from studying, and sorry, just a third example, which is not shown on screen, but I also studied the city of London, and how the medieval city of London would have had walls around it, but contemporary London has a ring of steel in the form of police sentry posts, CCTV cameras. There's kind of a virtual surveillance network there. But through this study of architecture, surveillance, paranoia, I began to ask, what about an architecture where experience is primarily non-visual, where it's not all about what is seen, but what is heard, what is felt, and those extra layers or textures in the built environment. So that informed my awakening. And just, yeah, onto the next slide. This is Kilmainham Jail. It's one of the most important historic sites in Dublin, the city where I'm based. A prison cell there. There's no view out, but natural light is let in. And there's a couple of interesting quotes that speak to that visual culture in architecture. Thomas Fuller said, light, God's eldest daughter, is a principal beauty in a building. I would argue that it's not the only beauty in a building. And also Louis Kahn, the very famous architect of the middle of the last century, said that a room is not a room without natural light, but there's much more to rooms than natural light and visual perception.
So you're speaking about light being an important aspect there, Rob. When I did my own orientation and mobility training, I would have spent a lot of time under blindfold to experience space and to learn how to move through it. How can architects experience that same kind of understanding?
So a piece that was part of my awakening, my coming to terms with non-visual perception and visual culture in architecture, was by a Polish artist, Mirosław Bałka. And this was exhibited in the Tate Modern back around 2009, 2010. An enormous steel box was built in the Tate Modern, and this light was absent from this exhibit. You scaled a ramp, you went up into this enormous container. The inside of the container was lined with felt, so it was very difficult to echolocate once you were inside that space. The air was noticeably cooler. You were in this enormous metal box, so it was much cooler in there than it was in the bigger air volume outside. And also, despite that felt lining and difficulty echolocating within the space, you would hear echoes from outside the container. So it again kind of distorted those boundaries of perception and maybe reduced the visual perception and emphasized other forms of perception. And that was an awakening for me. I'll just speak to a couple of quotes that are on screen here at the moment. So Konstantin Brancusi said that architecture is inhabited sculpture. I think that's a really nice way of thinking of buildings and public places. And there's a quote there as well from a Japanese author, Yoshio Taniguchi, who said that architecture is basically a container of something. I hope they will enjoy not so much the teacup, but the tea. So it speaks to enjoying the experience of buildings and places through all the senses. Yeah, I'll just skip on. So these studies led me to explore other aspects of human experience in space, how we are informed of and perceive our surroundings and sensory design. The photograph on screen shows the courtyard at the Salk Institute at the University of California. It was designed by Louis Kahn, the same architect I quoted a couple of slides back, who said a room is not a room without natural light. Kahn's courtyard is a low contrast environment, but it has a very definite linear feature there that could be useful for orientation and wayfinding. There's a water feature, so there's like a sensory water feature that babbles, and there's cooler air when you're beside it. It runs the length of this courtyard. It's a tactile element. But Aoife, I wondered about maybe other sensory elements that have serve a purpose for wayfinding where you wouldn't get your feet wet.
Thanks, Rob. That's a good question. So Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, said design is not just about what it looks like and feels like. Design is about how it works. So as an O&M, I'm experienced in making a building work to enable a person with vision impairment to be safe and independent within that space. I'm interested in the physical interaction with the building, how our vestibular and proprioceptive senses may be used to guide our movement through the space. I'm interested in the auditory qualities and how the sense of hearing can be used to help someone feel comfortable and orientate themselves. Building design that takes into account the needs of people who are blind is crucial for an inclusive society. So much more than a matter of compliance with regulations, but a matter of creating a welcome and inclusive environment. On this slide, I have a picture of tactile guidance paving in the Frankfurt History Museum and also in the metro in Warsaw. The pattern changes to alert the individual to the fact that they're at a decision point. And a well-designed building can make all of the difference for those who rely on other senses and mobility aids to move around. Richard Saul Wurman, the American architect, said that the fundamental failure of most design is its insistence on serving the god of looking good rather than the god of being good. This slide shows a picture of the entrance lobby of the civic offices of Cork City Council. In fact, it's the rear entrance. The front entrance has a much wider expanse of glass. Now, I appreciate that it may be difficult to see any features in this picture, but that's because there are very few features to actually see. There is no color contrast. There are invisible benches, an invisible reception desk, a glass wall that hides the exit door. There's no signage. There are spotlights that reflect on the glass tiles on the floor. And these get very slippy and noisy under wet shoes. And it's Ireland, so there are very frequently wet shoes walking through the lobby. And the noise bounces all around the hard surfaces in the space. This building won design awards back when it was designed and built in 2007, but they are now busy spending a lot of money retrofitting accessibility features. So Rob, examples like this exist all around the world. Do you have buildings that are designed with beauty and functionality?
I do, yes. Yeah, that's a very recent example that you've shown, or a relatively recent example, Aoife, of a building where sensory wayfinding, color contrast, basic accommodations were not addressed through the original design. But this is nothing new. And if we look to the Art Deco period around 100 years ago, there were beautiful colors in buildings, beautiful textures. Buildings were in many ways a little bit more three-dimensional, and you could touch and feel them. So the example shown on screen at the moment is a small enough building in the New Zealand city of Napier, the National Tobacco Company, but it's a fine example of Art Deco design with beautiful decoration, good color contrast throughout. So if we consider those Art Deco examples, there was good attention to form, color and texture and also in early modernism, not just in Art Deco. Here we have a very well-known work by the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto. It's the Villa Moreo. So this is a domestic design, a residential setting. Good color contrast, bringing in some of that beautiful Finnish timber to create texture, and also that informs how acoustics behave in the space. So yeah, this is nothing new, but unfortunately it's been forgotten, I think, through time. Attention to the other way spaces are perceived, the other way spaces are understood and used and appreciated. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. So yeah, moving on, the English architect David Chipperfield, he said there's a danger when every building has to look spectacular, to look like it is changing the world. I don't know how a building looks if it means something. Sorry, I don't care how a building looks if it means something, not to architects, but to the people who use it. And so that speaks kind of to a practicality of use rather than any self-indulgence on the part of designers. So as an architect, I was drawn to the Possibility Lab by this idea that buildings should serve more than the people who use them. They should work for everyone who moves through them. I'm intrigued by the way people learn about buildings that are new to them and how they move through them. We've talked about how people learn those features and ways of moving through space.
Yeah. So sight is a sense that makes it possible to observe a lot of information at a time. So for example, the size and shape of the room, the location of the exit door, and the distance to it. Like my route to that exit door is planned without even engaging any other sense. In contrast, tactile and auditory senses, the information is perceived and processed much more slowly than visual information. We have a picture of Escher's staircase here. Now, it's true, it may take some time to visually process a way around the room, but I can't even imagine how one would begin to do this using any other senses. So architects and designers have an understanding of space that focuses on visual qualities. The sighted people that they design for will orientate themselves from an overview of that space and form a picture in their brain of the surroundings and then focus on the detail of how to plan a route. They're not necessarily aware of the physical bodily experiences in relation to all of the senses. In contrast, people who are blind experience the space in a multi-sensory way, and the brain forms pictures from the sensory perception of that space.
So on an earlier field trip, I visited Barcelona. This would have been before I thought about sensory design and wayfinding in the way that I do now. And I visited some of Gaudi's wonderful designs, this one included, Park Güell. But without thinking about them in practical terms, and Gaudi designed without straight lines, because the quote we have on screen here from him says, "There are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature, therefore buildings must have no straight lines or sharp corners." So this picture shows Park Güell and these serpentine-like benches, but how would an O&M teach someone to navigate this space, Aoife?
Okay, so people create mental maps by sequentially joining landmark to landmark to form a picture of the surroundings. People use tactile landmarks, for example, a path edge or a slope. Navigating along this route, if you require a physical shoreline, would be a difficult and onerous task. Rob, you and I have also talked about how people use audible clues and echoes as a sound source, and how those with some useful vision will use clear, visible landmarks. So in Park Güell, some could use the brightly coloured wall, and some would use the features on the horizon. But my point is that those features weren't designed for wayfinding. It's not a function of the design. But this is how people with the vision impairment and low vision and O&M instructors the world over have to work to find incidental landmarks in the environment to create a route. Brenda Laurel, an American designer, said, "A design isn't finished until someone is using it." We would say that a design isn't finished until everyone is using it. Designing an accessible building doesn't have to be an exclusive art form. Inclusion of braille and tactile signage, appropriate color contrast, tactile paving can all help people to navigate and locate key features within the building. Incorporating features in the design such as handrails, audible signs, clear signals, non-slip surfaces can all improve safety in a building. Good lighting, clear acoustics, and a predictable layout can help people feel that they're in a comfortable and welcoming space. Confidence and social interaction will be promoted by providing spaces that are easy to navigate and help people to connect and participate. These are critical components of a truly inclusive society. For Rob and I, this is our everyday work in the Possibility Lab. Do you have some examples that you can show people that we've worked on?
I certainly can, yeah. So I've brought a couple of case studies, and the first of those is a public realm scheme that we're involved in Cove, which is a regional town near Cork City in the south of Ireland. Cove, perhaps best known also as the last port of call for the Titanic on its maiden voyage. So the Cork County Council have come up with a public realm proposal for the town that's going to be developed in 6 phases. 2 of those are along the old harbour front down by the sea. And they're designed as shared spaces, which we know cause bring their own access issues, and there needs to be careful consideration of design in those spaces. So we've collaborated with the local authority, with our engineers and architects, with material suppliers, with end users to research and justify a design solution that indicates the gateways to those shared spaces, provides guidance within them, and makes them safer, inclusive, accessible spaces for everyone. So that has part of that work has involved researching novel paving products that have never been used in Ireland before. We're talking about acoustic tiles that respond to the touch of a cane, tactile products that haven't seen use in Ireland. We've seen blister paving, but maybe we haven't seen other types that are being considered there. And these materials will not only define the boundaries of shared space, but guide people through them, guide them to points of interest along the route. And that I touched on the various parties involved there, the comms, end users, designers, all involved in developing those proposals. This scheme, while it's been built out in phases, it has already received recognition. It was awarded a silver medal at the Royal Institute of Architects Awards in Ireland last year. Second case study that I have is from Kilkenny, another regional city in the south of Ireland. The Abbey Quarter master plan, which is being developed along the riverfront in Kilkenny City. It is a large site, former brewery and abbey building on it, a historic abbey building along the riverfront. It's going to be the site, we hope, of Ireland's first Braille trail. So there'll be continuous tactile guidance through the space, but also at points of interest, there'll be smartphone supported assistive technologies embedded in the public realm so that people will be able to access wayfinding information, but also information about points of interest, be it the river or the abbey or some historic building that's there on the site. The design there also incorporates tactile elements, sensory landscape elements, and we're collaborating closely with local end users, the local access group, comms, architects, all involved here. That team collaboration was recognised in NCBI's own Vision Awards in 2022. So maybe just to speak briefly after those case studies to speak to the research we've been doing into these new products we've developed on our own site at our National Head Office and Training Centre, a pilot space where we test out these new pedestrian materials, like acoustic, ceramic and metal tiles, also using traditional or perhaps more familiar tactile products in parallel with those so that there's a control, so we can test what's effective and what's known, and also embedding assistive technologies in the space. And we had feedback from testing with end users, a survey that asked them for their feedback on the traditional paving and the enhanced or futuristic paving, if you like. And the lessons learned from that research, we're hoping will inform next steps for these new materials to be rolled out elsewhere in Ireland. Sorry. Yeah, so we hope this research will see better access outcomes in streets all over Ireland. And now that you've seen examples of our work, we hope you'll feel empowered to do the same. We know that great oak trees from little acorns grow. Aoife, what do we need to change to make that change?
Okay, that's a good question. What are the solutions and where are we going? As Charles Eames said, recognizing need is the primary condition for design. So our architects, our engineers and designers have to have a knowledge of the need in order to be able to produce truly inclusive design. Now, it will be wonderful to see the academic material developing a greater consciousness of the bodily experience of space to be included in the curricula of education, to have professional training that encompasses awareness of all of the senses and different degrees of all abilities. But transforming professional discipline is quite an extensive undertaking. So we have standards and regulations, but these in themselves do not give an understanding of user requirements. Designing using checklists will fail to capture what's important to consider in urban design. This picture shows stainless steel bollards along the middle of a grey footpath. The bollards create an obstacle course and can be invisible to those with low vision and can also create a glare issue. Good design requires knowledge to understand the background of the functional requirements of people with vision impairment. Understanding how people with low or no vision orientate themselves using physical environments as clues for orientation within the urban environment is paramount. Designers may be keen to understand how people who are blind perceive space, but they don't know where to go to find this information. We're very lucky. We have an architect. We have someone who speaks the language. But if this is not feasible for you, we would encourage O&M experts to integrate themselves into the local planning systems, to connect with the architects and the engineers, to undertake the awareness training with them, to take them on experiential walks. These have all been very successful approaches for us. I had 2 additional controlled crossings added into the design of a main street in a town local to me, following on from awareness training with the architect. We're getting to the point where we are being contacted now when new projects are being considered in the areas. To persuade designers to implement the accessibility features, find an example of a building in your area that has to be retrofitted, in costing time and money. Bad design costs the same as good design. I have images on the screen here of an architect drawing and a footpath that has been blocked off with roadworks because, as Frank Lloyd Wright said, you can use an eraser on the drafting table or a sledgehammer on the construction site. Let them see that design is adding value, not cost. If you can demonstrate that good access is good business, you'll be in a strong position to encourage the architects and engineers and designers and business owners to incorporate good design. In Ireland, it was calculated that the spending power of people with a disability is upwards of 3.3 billion. 75% of people with a disability and their families have walked away from a business because of poor accessibility or customer service. These are big numbers, so it just makes sense to design safe and accessible spaces where everyone has the opportunity to participate in a fully strong and cohesive society. Design has the power to include or exclude. We would encourage the involvement of people with vision impairment in the design process, following the nothing about me without me ethos. This would help to reduce more than the physical barriers causing the gap between the individual and independence, and to ensure that the universal values of the United Nations Sustainability Goal, no one left behind, are upheld. The final slide that we have on screen there is just a summary, really, of the last few points that we've been talking about. And we thought we would just leave them there while we ask the floor, are there any questions at all?